The single mother's impossible choice. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who smile while their world is falling apart. And sometimes, on a game show stage, under bright lights, the masks we wear to protect the people we love become too heavy to carry alone. The Family Feud studio hummed with its familiar pre-show energy, bathed in the warm glow of blue and gold lights that had witnessed thousands of moments of joy, surprise, and human connection. Steve Harvey stood at center stage in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, adjusting his tie with the practiced confidence of a man who had made this ritual his own over countless tapings. It was Wednesday afternoon in Los Angeles, and the energy felt different today. Not different in a way that would concern producers or worry the crew, but different in the way that air feels just before lightning strikes, charged with possibility, heavy with something waiting to unfold. On the left side of the stage stood the Morrison family from Denver, Colorado. 3 generations of teachers and coaches who had driven 18 hours in a rented van to be here. They carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who had spent their lives working with children, comfortable with being watched, natural at performing under pressure. On the right side stood a family that looked different, smaller, more fragile, more precious. The Johnson family, from Bakersfield, California, consisted of just 4 people. But they filled their space with the kind of determined energy that comes from people who have learned to make the most of what they have. At the center of their lineup stood Sarah Johnson, 35 years old, wearing a navy dress that was clearly her best, pressed carefully, chosen thoughtfully, worn with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the importance of making a good impression. Beside her stood her 3 children, arranged in order of height like steps leading up to their mother's strength. Marcus, 15, tall for his age with the serious expression of a teenager who had been forced to grow up faster than he should have. Lily, 12, with braids tied with yellow ribbons and the kind of bright smile that suggested an unshakable optimism. And James, 8, the baby of the family, fidgeting slightly in his button-down shirt, but beaming with the excitement of being somewhere he'd only seen on television. To anyone watching, they looked like a typical American family, a single mother and her children, probably working hard to make ends meet like millions of other families across the country, but happy to be here, grateful for the opportunity to compete for money that could make a real difference in their lives. What the audience couldn't see was the secret Sarah had been carrying for 8 months. What they couldn't know was the impossible choice she made every single day between her own survival and her children's happiness. What they couldn't understand was that Sarah Johnson was dying, and her children had no idea. The diagnosis had come on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by Dr. Martinez at Kern Medical Center, with the kind of professional compassion that doctors learn when they have to give people the worst news of their lives. Stage 3 breast cancer. Aggressive, treatable, but requiring immediate and intensive intervention. We need to start chemotherapy within the next 2 weeks, Dr. Martinez had said, sliding a folder across his desk that contained treatment plans, medication schedules, and cost estimates that made Sarah's head spin. With proper treatment, your survival rate is very good. Without it, he hadn't needed to finish the sentence. Sarah had driven home from that appointment in a daze, her mind racing through calculations that no mother should ever have to make. The treatment would cost $47,000 over 6 months. Her insurance through her job at the local elementary school would cover 60%, leaving her responsible for nearly $19,000. $19,000 that she didn't have. $19,000 that represented more money than she'd ever seen in one place. $19,000 that might as well have been $19 million. That night, after Marcus had finished his homework and Lily had practiced piano and James had been tucked into bed with his favorite story, Sarah had sat at her kitchen table with a calculator, a pile of bills, and a notebook. She'd added up her salary, subtracted her expenses, and arrived at a number that made her stomach drop. Even if she stopped buying groceries and turned off the utilities and never put gas in her car again, she couldn't afford the treatment. But Sarah Johnson had not spent 15 years raising 3 children alone by giving up when faced with impossible odds. She'd sold her wedding ring first, the simple gold band that had been the only thing of value she'd kept after her divorce. Then she'd sold her car and bought an older one with cash, pocketing the difference. She'd taken on a second job cleaning offices at night after her children went to bed. When that still wasn't enough, she'd made the hardest decision of her life. She'd sold her house, the small 3-bedroom ranch that had been the only stable home her children had ever known, and moved them into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment across town. She'd told the children it was temporary, that they needed to save money for college funds and family vacations. She'd never told them that every penny from the sale of their home was going toward keeping their mother alive. For 8 months, Sarah had been living a double life. By day, she was mom, packing lunches, helping with homework, attending parent-teacher conferences, and school plays. She smiled at soccer games and birthday parties and family dinners, maintaining the illusion that everything was normal, that their reduced circumstances were just a temporary adjustment, that their future was bright and certain. By night, after the children were asleep, she was a cancer patient. She'd drive herself to chemotherapy sessions at 6 a.m., sitting in sterile rooms with IV lines in her arm, timing the treatments so she could be home before the children woke up. She'd learned to hide her fatigue behind extra coffee and concealer. She'd bought wigs that matched her natural hair color so perfectly that not even Marcus, with his sharp 15-year-old observation skills, had noticed the change. She'd gotten very good at vomiting silently in the bathroom, with the water running so no one would hear. She'd perfected the art of eating dinner when she had no appetite, of laughing at James's jokes when every part of her body ached, of helping Lily with math homework when the chemotherapy fog made it hard to think clearly. The hardest part wasn't the physical pain or the financial stress, or even the fear of dying. The hardest part was the loneliness. Sarah carried the weight of her diagnosis entirely alone, protecting her children from the knowledge that their world could collapse at any moment. She'd told herself it was the right choice. Children shouldn't have to worry about losing their mother. They shouldn't have to carry the burden of adult fears and adult decisions. They deserved to feel safe and loved and normal for as long as possible. But the isolation was killing her almost as surely as the cancer. The Family Feud application had arrived in her email, like a sign from the universe. The show was holding auditions in Fresno, just 2 hours away, looking for families with compelling stories. Sarah had applied not because she thought they'd win, but because she'd promised herself that if she survived the treatment, and Dr. Martinez was cautiously optimistic that she wanted to do something special with her children, something they'd remember forever, whether she was there to share the memory or not. When the call came saying they'd been selected, Sarah had cried for 20 minutes in her car in the school parking lot. Happy tears, sad tears, grateful tears, terrified tears, all mixed together in the complex emotional cocktail that had become her daily experience. Now, standing on the bright stage with cameras rolling and an audience cheering, Sarah felt like she was living in a dream. Her children were glowing with excitement beside her. Marcus trying to play it cool but clearly thrilled, Lily bouncing slightly on her toes, James waving enthusiastically at the cameras. Steve Harvey had been charming during the family introductions, making jokes about how good-looking the Johnson family was, asking the children about school and sports and their dreams for the future. He'd paid special attention to Sarah, commenting on what a great job she was doing raising 3 kids on her own, making sure the audience understood that single mothers were some of the strongest people in the world. Sarah had smiled and thanked him, playing her part perfectly. But something in Steve's expression suggested he'd noticed what others missed. The slight tremor in her hands, the way she held herself just a little too carefully. The shadow behind her smile that spoke of burdens carried in secret. The game had progressed normally through the first 3 rounds. The Johnson family was holding their own against the Morrison family, with Marcus showing surprising knowledge of pop culture and Lily's enthusiasm, infectious enough to get the whole audience clapping along with her answers. Sarah had managed to give solid answers when her turn came, drawing on the vast repository of random knowledge that all mothers accumulate from helping with homework, watching educational programs with their children, and paying attention to the world around them, with the heightened awareness that comes from being solely responsible for other people's lives. But she could feel her energy flagging. It was Wednesday, 2 days after her latest chemotherapy session, and the fatigue was settling into her bones like a heavy blanket. She'd learned to push through it, had developed strategies for functioning when her body wanted to shut down. But the bright lights and the adrenaline of being on television were taking more out of her than she'd expected. Still, she held it together. For Marcus, who was trying so hard to be the man of the family. For Lily, who deserved to feel proud of her mother. For James, who might be too young to remember this day, but old enough to sense the importance of it. Then came the fourth round, and the question that would strip away 8 months of carefully constructed pretense. "All right, Johnson family," Steve announced, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had endeared him to millions of viewers. "This one's for you." Top 6 answers on the board. The studio lights seemed to intensify as Steve opened his card, and Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the excitement of the game. Lately, stress made her cancer symptoms worse, made the fatigue deeper and the nausea more persistent. "We asked 100 people," Steve said, his voice carrying across the studio with practiced ease. "What's one thing a mother would never be able to do for her children?" It was such a normal Family Feud question, the kind of thing that usually generated answers like, embarrass them, or let them stay up all night, or buy them everything they want. The kind of question designed to celebrate the dedication of mothers while acknowledging the reasonable limits that come with good parenting. But for Sarah Johnson, it was like being asked to confess the central tragedy of her life in front of millions of strangers. Marcus stepped up to the buzzer first, his teenage confidence on full display. "Let them get hurt," he announced, with the certainty of someone who had grown up watching his mother fix every scraped knee and broken heart. "Let them get hurt," Steve repeated approvingly. "Good answer," survey says. The board lit up. Number 2 answer, worth 28 points. The Johnson family cheered, and Sarah forced herself to smile and clap along with them. Even as the irony of the answer cut through her like a blade, she was about to hurt her children in the worst possible way, and they had no idea it was coming. Lily bounced up to the buzzer next, her yellow ribbons catching the studio lights. "Make them eat vegetables they hate," she called out with the wisdom of a 12-year-old who had been in many battles over broccoli. The audience laughed, and even the Morrison family smiled at her enthusiasm. The board responded positively. Number 5, worth 12 points. Another cheer from the Johnson family. Another forced smile from Sarah. James took his turn with the unself-conscious joy of an 8-year-old who had never met a microphone he didn't like. "Make them go to bed early when they're not tired," he announced. And the audience erupted in appreciation for his honesty. Number 4 on the board, 15 points. The Johnson family was building a substantial lead, and everything should have felt perfect. But as each answer appeared on the board, Sarah felt the weight of her secret growing heavier. Each response was a reminder of all the normal mothering challenges she'd navigated over the years, all the ordinary problems she'd solved, all the typical boundaries she'd maintained. None of those things seemed important anymore, when measured against the one thing she might not be able to do: stay alive long enough to see her children grow up. When her turn came, Sarah approached the buzzer like she was walking toward a cliff edge. The studio lights felt hot on her face, and she could hear her heartbeat in her ears. Around her, the audience waited expectantly. Her children watched with pride, and Steve Harvey prepared to hear another light-hearted answer about the humorous limitations of motherhood. "Sarah," Steve said, and something in his voice was different now, gentler, more attentive. "What's something a mother would never be able to do for her children?" Sarah looked at the board, but the words were swimming together. In her mind, she could see Dr. Martinez's face as he delivered her diagnosis, could hear his voice explaining that, with treatment, her 5-year survival rate was 85%. Good odds, he'd said. Very promising. But 15% was not zero. 15% meant there was a chance, a real, statistical, undeniable chance, that she wouldn't be there for high school graduations or first dates or wedding days. 15% meant there was a possibility that Marcus would have to be the man of the house in ways no 15-year-old should ever have to handle. Protect them from everything, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible over the studio's ambient noise. Steve's expression shifted slightly. He'd been expecting something lighter, something that would keep the energy up and the audience laughing. But something in Sarah's tone, a weight that went beyond the words themselves, made him pause. Protect them from everything, Steve repeated slowly. Survey says, the answer wasn't on the board. Normally this would be the moment for Steve to offer gentle consolation and move on to the opposing family. The game would continue, the energy would build, and everyone would laugh about the answer that didn't quite work. Instead, Steve found himself walking closer to Sarah. Something about the way she delivered that answer, something about the way she was holding herself, triggered every paternal instinct Steve had developed over decades of being both a father and a television host, who cared about the people who trusted him with their stories. You all right, Sarah? He asked gently, his voice carrying the kind of concern that transcends television's entertainment. That's when 8 months of carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Sarah looked up at Steve Harvey, and for the first time since her diagnosis, she found herself looking into the eyes of someone who seemed to see past the performance she'd been giving for her children's sake. Someone who recognized the weight she was carrying and wasn't afraid to acknowledge it. I'm trying to be, she whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of holding everything together for just a little bit longer. Steve's expression shifted completely. The game show host persona fell away, replaced by something deeper, more personal. He'd interviewed thousands of people over his career, and he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was carrying more than they were saying. What's going on? He asked quietly, stepping closer to her at the podium. Talk to me. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically whispering into their headsets, trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected development. The Morrison family stood quietly at their podium, sensing that something significant was happening, but not sure whether they should intervene or give the moment space. Marcus, Lily, and James watched their mother with growing concern, seeing something in her expression that they'd never seen before, a kind of vulnerability that Sarah had worked so hard to hide from them. Sarah started, then stopped. She'd practiced this moment in her mind 100 times, imagining how she would eventually tell her children about her diagnosis. But she'd always pictured it happening at home, in private, when she could control the environment and the timing. She'd never imagined it happening on national television, under bright lights, with hundreds of strangers watching. But looking at Steve Harvey's face, seeing the genuine concern there, the invitation to trust him with whatever truth she was carrying, Sarah felt something break open inside her chest. 8 months of carrying this secret alone had been slowly suffocating her, and suddenly she needed to breathe more than she needed to protect her children from reality. I have cancer, she said, and the words fell into the studio like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond their point of impact. The audience didn't gasp immediately. The words took a moment to register, to settle into understanding. But when they did, a profound silence fell over the studio that was different from any quiet they'd ever experienced during a taping. Steve Harvey, who had made his living with words for decades, found himself momentarily speechless. Behind him, the Morrison family exchanged glances of shock and sympathy. In the audience, people reached for their companions' hands, needing human connection to process what they were hearing. But it was the faces of Sarah's children that would haunt everyone who witnessed this moment. Marcus's expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror as his mother's words sank in. His 15-year-old composure cracked, and suddenly, he looked like the child he still was, faced with a truth too big for anyone his age to carry. Lily's bright smile faded as she processed information that didn't fit with anything she understood about how the world was supposed to work. Mothers weren't supposed to get sick. Mothers were supposed to be the ones who took care of everyone else. James, at 8, didn't fully understand the word cancer. But he understood the way everyone's faces had changed, understood that something scary had just happened to his mother. "Mom?" Marcus said, his voice cracking. "What do you mean?" Sarah looked at her children, her beautiful, innocent children, who had just had their world shifted beneath their feet, and felt the last of her carefully constructed strength dissolve. "I've been sick, baby," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "I've been sick for 8 months, and I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to be scared." Steve Harvey placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder, his touch both grounding and supportive. In that moment, he wasn't a game show host, managing a television program. He was a father himself, watching a mother try to find words for the impossible. "How sick?" Lily asked, her 12-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of what they all needed to know. Sarah took a shaky breath, looking at Steve for strength before turning back to her children. "I have breast cancer. I've been getting treatment, and the doctors think I'm going to be okay," but she couldn't finish the sentence. "How do you tell your children that there's a chance you might not survive, see them grow up? How do you explain that every decision you've made for the past 8 months has been influenced by the possibility that your time with them might be limited?" Steve stepped in, his voice gentle but clear. "But it's scary," he said, speaking the truth that Sarah couldn't quite voice. "And it's expensive, and it's hard to go through alone." Sarah nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I sold the house," she said, the words coming easier now that the dam had broken. "I sold everything I could sell to pay for treatment. I took on a second job. I've been going to chemotherapy at 6 in the morning so you wouldn't know, wearing wigs so you wouldn't see that I lost my hair." The studio was completely silent now, except for the quiet sounds of crying from the audience. People were reaching for tissues, wiping their eyes, processing the magnitude of what this mother had been carrying alone. "You've been doing this by yourself?" Steve asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want them to worry," Sarah said, gesturing to her children. "They're kids. They should be worried about homework and friends and normal kid things, not whether their mother is going to die." Marcus stepped forward then, his teenage pride warring with his need to comfort his mother. "Mom, we could have helped. We could have done something." "You're 15, baby," Sarah said gently. "It's not your job to worry about adult problems. But it is our job to worry about you," Lily said, her voice small but determined. "You're our mom. If you're sick, we want to know. We want to help." Steve Harvey stood in the middle of this family crisis, feeling the weight of witnessing something so profound and private unfolding in such a public space. He'd hosted thousands of episodes of Family Feud, had seen families celebrate victories and cope with defeats, had facilitated moments of joy and surprise and connection. But this was different. This was a moment when entertainment had transformed into something sacred, when a game show had had a place of healing and truth-telling. "Hold on," Steve said, his voice carrying across the studio with quiet authority. "Just hold on a minute." He turned to address the audience and the cameras, his expression serious in a way that his viewers rarely saw. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what we're witnessing here isn't just television anymore. This is a family dealing with something that no family should have to face alone. This is a mother who has been carrying an impossible burden by herself for 8 months." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the studio. "Sarah Johnson has been fighting cancer while working 2 jobs and raising 3 children, and she's been doing it all in secret because she wanted to protect her kids from being scared. That's not just motherhood, that's heroism." Steve walked back to Sarah, who was now surrounded by her children. Marcus had moved to stand protectively beside her, Lily was holding her hand, and James was leaning against her side, needing the physical comfort of his mother's presence. Sarah, Steve said gently, "How much do you still owe for your treatment?" Sarah hesitated, embarrassed to discuss money in front of so many people, but she'd already revealed her deepest secret. Financial details seemed almost insignificant in comparison. "About $12,000, she said quietly. "I've been making payments, but—" She didn't need to finish. Everyone understood the mathematics of survival, how treatment costs and lost work time and the expenses of daily life with 3 children could create an impossible equation. Steve nodded, his expression thoughtful. Then he made a decision that would change the Johnson family's life forever. "Here's what we're going to do," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made up his mind to solve a problem. "The game doesn't matter anymore. The points don't matter. What matters is that this family gets the help they need." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "Sarah, this has my direct number on it. Not my agent, not my publicist, mine. I want you to call me tonight, and we're going to figure out how to get your medical bills taken care of." The audience began to murmur with appreciation, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. But Steve wasn't finished. "And furthermore," he said, turning to address the cameras directly, "I want everyone watching this show understand something. Sarah Johnson represents thousands of families across this country who are dealing with medical crises that threaten not just their health, but their financial security." He paused, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "Healthcare in America shouldn't force a mother to choose between treating her cancer and keeping a roof over her children's heads. No parent should have to sell their home to afford life-saving treatment. No family should have to carry this kind of burden alone." Steve walked back to center stage, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the studio. "So here's what we're going to do right now, live on television. We're going to call the billing department at Kern Medical Center and see if we can work something out for the Johnson family." The production team scrambled to make the call happen, patching through to the hospital's financial services department, while the cameras rolled and the audience held its breath. Within minutes, they had a supervisor on the line. Steve explained the situation. A single mother, cancer patient, already paid most of her bill through enormous personal sacrifice, just needed help with the remaining balance. "What would it take," Steve asked into the phone, "to forgive the remaining debt for this family?" There was a pause as the supervisor consulted with colleagues and superiors. "Mr. Harvey," came the voice through the studio speakers, "we've been following Mrs. Johnson's case. She's been incredibly responsible about her payments despite her circumstances. We'd be honored to forgive the remaining balance." The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual game show celebration. This was something deeper, the sound of people witnessing kindness in action, justice being served, a wrong being made right. Sarah collapsed into her children's arms, overcome by relief that was 8 months in the making. Marcus wrapped his long arms around his mother and siblings, finally able to be the protector he'd been trying to be, without knowing what he was protecting them from. Lily cried with the intensity of a 12-year-old processing emotions too complex for her age, while James simply held on to his mother like an anchor in a storm he didn't fully understand, but knew had passed. Steve watched this family moment unfold, his own eyes wet with tears he made no effort to hide. In 40 years of entertainment, he'd never experienced anything like this. The moment when television became ministry, when performance became authentic human connection. "That's what Family Feud is really about," he said, his voice carrying across the studio with quiet conviction. "It's not about the money, or the prizes, or the competition. It's about families. It's about love. It's about showing up for each other when life gets hard." He paused, looking directly into the camera that would carry this moment to millions of viewers. "Sarah Johnson has spent 8 months showing her children what strength looks like. Today, they're showing her what love looks like. And all of us, everyone in this studio, everyone watching at home, We're learning what it means to be human. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with only minimal editing. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, the show's website had crashed from the volume of people trying to share Sarah's story and offer additional support to the family. A GoFundMe campaign started by viewers raised over $100,000 in the first week, money that would ensure Sarah could focus on her recovery without worrying about lost income from missing work for treatment. But perhaps more importantly, Sarah's story sparked a national conversation about healthcare costs and the impossible choices that families face when dealing with serious illnesses. News programs picked up the story, politicians referenced it in debates, and medical advocacy groups used it to illustrate the human cost of a system that treats healthcare as a commodity rather than a right. 3 months later, Steve received a photo in the mail. It showed Sarah and her 3 children at Lily's middle school graduation, all of them smiling with the genuine joy of people who had survived something terrible and come out stronger on the other side. On the back of the photo, Sarah had written, "Thank you for giving me the courage to stop protecting my children from the truth and start letting them protect me. We're going to be okay." The last line made Steve smile. P.S. My latest scan was clear. Turns out love really is the best medicine. Sarah kept Steve's business card in her wallet, not because she needed to use it, but because it reminded her of the day when carrying her burden alone became impossible, and she discovered that some loads are meant to be shared. Her children never forgot the lesson they learned that day. Not just about their mother's courage, but about their own capacity to handle difficult truths with grace and strength. Marcus graduated high school with honors and went on to study medicine, inspired by the doctors who had saved his mother's life. Lily became a fierce advocate for healthcare reform, writing essays and giving speeches about families like hers who shouldn't have to choose between survival and financial security. And James, who had been too young to fully understand what happened that day, grew up knowing that his mother was the strongest person in the world, and that sometimes strength means asking for help. The question that had started it all, what's one thing a mother would never be able to do for her children, had revealed a truth that Sarah couldn't have articulated 8 months earlier. A mother can't protect her children from everything, but what she can do is teach them that they are strong enough to handle whatever comes, brave enough to face difficult truths, and loved enough to never have to face those truths alone. Sometimes the most powerful gift a parent can give their children is the trust that they are capable of handling the real world in all its complexity and pain, and unexpected grace. That's what Sarah Johnson learned the day she stopped trying to be invincible and started being human instead. Disclaimer: this content is a dramatized narrative created for educational and inspirational purposes. While inspired by real challenges faced by families dealing with cancer and healthcare costs, the specific events and dialogue are fictional. The story is designed to entertain, inspire, and encourage discussions about healthcare accessibility and family strength. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.